What is subject matter jurisdiction? Well, in civil procedure, a civil court needs 3 things to hear and decide a case before it. Number 1, a civil court needs subject matter jurisdiction over the particular type of case that's being heard, personal jurisdiction over the defendant, and venue in the proper judicial district. Now, if any of these 3 things are missing, then that court, that civil court, does not have the authority to hear and decide the case before it, which means if the plaintiff wishes to pursue that cause of action, that case is going to have to be moved or transferred to a court that does have all 3 of these things: subject matter jurisdiction over the particular type of case that's being heard, personal jurisdiction over the defendant, and venue in the proper judicial district. Now, in today's video, we're just focusing on subject matter jurisdiction, which is the first requirement that a civil court needs to hear and decide a case before. Now, the first thing to think about when you're considering subject matter jurisdiction is to recognize the difference between state courts and federal courts. Now, if you've never been inside a courtroom in your life, and maybe you're an incoming 1L, you know nothing about civil procedure, I bet you can guess what the difference between state courts and federal courts are. State courts typically are going to be a little bit more laid back, a little bit more relaxed, while federal courts are more formal, a little bit more procedural. You know, different attorneys have different preferences, but probably your average attorney prefers to be practicing in a state court over a federal court unless you have a lot of experience in a federal court. But the point here with subject matter jurisdiction is, and why it's important to recognize that state courts are a little more relaxed and federal courts are a little bit more formal, is that subject matter jurisdiction acts as a jurisdictional bar to prevent any case under the sun from being brought in federal court. Basically, what subject matter jurisdiction is saying is that only a very particular and narrow set of cases are going to be allowed to be heard in federal courts. Cases that we deem important enough for the formalities of federal court are the ones that we're going to allow federal courts to hear. So think about if you are going to sue your neighbor who lives across the street for $100 for some breach of contract claim. You know, maybe their kid was supposed to mow your lawn, did a bad job, whatever, breach of contract, you're suing. You think that's going to rise to the level of a federal court claim? No. That's going to fall under state court systems. We don't want your $100 breach of contract claim against a 16-year-old kid, you know, across the street, or his parents for $100 being brought in federal court. We can't tie up federal courts with that type of case. Now, on the other hand, if a case is rising to that level, right, it's a particular set of cases, things that arise under federal law. You're suing somebody under a federal statutory claim, or I'm suing you for copyright infringement, right? That's in the U.S. Constitution. Those types of claims are going to rise to a level where now maybe a federal court can hear it. Or, and we'll talk about this in other videos, if there's diversity of citizenship, somebody from Texas is suing a defendant that's in New York. If certain requirements are met there, then a federal court might also have jurisdiction because you have diversity of citizenship. But we'll talk about all of that in way more detail later. The thing to recognize now with subject matter jurisdiction is that it's just a jurisdictional bar to keep, you know, claims that don't rise to the level necessary to be heard in federal court out of federal courts, because we don't want to tie up federal courts with, you know, nonsense type claims that are a little bit more formal, a little bit more important. So what this means, though, and the big takeaway for subject matter jurisdiction, is on a civil procedure fact pattern. You're taking an exam and you are coming across what you think might be a subject matter jurisdiction issue. The first question to ask yourself is, does this issue, does this fact pattern, does this call of the question involve a federal court or a state court? Because if it involves only a state court, there's no federal court involved in that fact pattern or that call of the question, then you shouldn't be talking about anything at all related to subject matter jurisdiction. Do not discuss anything about subject matter jurisdiction if you're dealing with a state court. State courts, remember, can hear almost any type of case. They have what we like to call unlimited subject matter jurisdiction. There's not going to be issues of subject matter jurisdiction if you're dealing with a state court. Only going to come up if you're dealing with a federal court. Remember, formal courts, federal courts, there's less of them, can only hear less cases. We want to keep that $100 breach of contract claim against your neighbor in state court, not federal court. So subject matter jurisdiction, only discuss if you're dealing with a federal court. That's the big takeaway. And you can immediately move on to these next two questions, right? Personal jurisdiction and venue. If you know you're dealing with a state court, you can basically just skip subject matter jurisdiction. Pretty cool if you're on a civil procedure essay and you know that the question is involving a pure state court. There's no federal court involved. You can basically skip right through subject matter jurisdiction, which is a ton of analysis, a ton of time that could be wasted, and I promise you other students will waste their time discussing subject matter jurisdiction. When it's a state court, they're gonna lose a ton of points. You won't, because you know state court, you're not talking about subject matter jurisdiction. That's the main keys though to what subject matter jurisdiction is in civil procedure. I hope this makes sense. See you at our next video.